Thank you, Senator. Senator Bacic, 8 minutes.
Good Chair. I'd like to join in the welcome to Minister Sherlock, and congratulations to the Minister. And to welcome the support that's been expressed from across the House for this motion. And I'm standing in for Senator Maurice Cummins, so I'm acting leader in proposing this motion, and I know Senator Cummins very much welcomes the support there is too. And indeed, I want to say at the start that I do very much welcome the commitment shown by the Government in undertaking to take 4,000 refugees in light of the current refugee crisis, and indeed to welcome the huge outpouring of compassion and empathy and sympathy for the appalling plight of the refugees who we've seen crossing the Mediterranean Sea and crossing over land through Turkey and through Greece and up through Croatia in recent months. The plight of these families is appalling. I speak as somebody whose own family came here to seek refuge in 1946, my grandfather and my father as a young child. And, so as all of this was said, we're not very far removed from migration ourselves. And indeed, we should, with our own history, be very mindful of the need to show sympathy to others who make this crossing. But we know that there's a humanitarian crisis for Syrian families who have fled Syria, the many hundreds of thousands who have now fled Syria, most of whom are living, as we know, in refugee camps in the neighbouring states, as you said, Minister, states like Lebanon, where we see 1 million out of a population of 4 million now are refugees, 2 million Syrians now in Turkey in refugee camps, all in dire situations, and where the world community does need to take action to address the humanitarian crisis there. And then, of course, the other humanitarian crisis that's been unfolding on a much bigger scale this year than in previous years, with so many people undertaking the treacherous journey across to reach EU countries across the Mediterranean or across land. And we've seen indeed 3,000 people dying this year on the Mediterranean. This year alone, approximately 3,000 people, including the small boy Aylan Kurdi, whose photograph touched us all so deeply. As you said, Minister, the Irish vessels that have taken part in the relief effort and their crew have to be absolutely commended, and they've done hugely important work. And it's also very welcome that we've given such support with Irish aid. Yesterday on the Justice Committee, we heard in more detail about the planning that is going on in respect of the resettlement and relocation of refugees. And it's important, as we heard, to distinguish between the two. We've undertaken to resettle from Lebanon, from frontline camps, 520 refugees, and we understand their status will be predetermined. They will come to Ireland as refugees. But then, as you've said, Minister, an additional 2,450 are to be relocated over a 2-year period from transit, effectively, from transit across Europe, in particular from Italy and Greece. And we know that there's then about 1,000 more who we will be taking in on one of those bases. We very much welcomed on the Justice Committee the news that we heard from Michael Curran, the head of the Irish Naturalisation and Immigration Service, and from the Refugee Applications Commissioner, David Costello. They assured us that preparation is ongoing, that the task force has met, as you've said, and that resources are being put in place. We expressed particular concern about the mechanism for determining status of the 2,450 people. As you've said, Minister, it is anticipated that people who come here on this basis, on a relocation basis, will not have their status predetermined, and therefore will be accommodated in what are to be known as emergency reception and orientation centres. But I share the concerns of others on the Justice Committee today that this doesn't become another form of direct provision. We all know the huge problems in direct provision centres, and we're all extremely anxious that these centres would not house people awaiting decisions on status for more than a few weeks at a time. I received an assurance personally when I questioned him from the Refugee Applications Commissioner that he is recruiting more staff on a panel basis to ensure that applications can be processed swiftly. He did, however, say that they will also need enhanced resources for the family reunification applications that will follow. And Minister, just 2 points on that. First, you mentioned the Syrian humanitarian and mission programme, under which 111 vulnerable people from Syria were granted permission to reside in Ireland last year, following applications from family members here. But I'm told there were 308 applications, so only 1/3 of those were granted. And I know from some of the Syrian families here just how distressing that was. And I wonder, can we see perhaps a more generous approach to family reunification? And indeed, there's another concern, I think, that in the International Protection Bill as currently drafted, it appears provisions on family reunification will not, or currently, I understand, are not included. So I think we need to ensure that we have a generous approach to family reunification. In terms of housing and accommodation, clearly there are concerns, as I've said. I would say that, we all absolutely have rightly praised Germany for its open approach to admission of refugees. I know from colleagues in Germany that public buildings have been turned over, and often buildings like school halls and community halls and barracks and so on. So it is you know, if there is no other way of doing it, then this is appropriate for a short-term provision. So I think we all understand that. But again, we need to be sure that decisions will be made in a matter of weeks, so that families in particular are not housed in inappropriate accommodation for long-term periods. And we were told finally that the end of the year would see the first arrivals. We asked for a time frame because clearly this is very urgent. And I think this brings me to a very particular issue that in your department that I think is a concern, which is that we know there are tens of thousands of Syrian people in particular, also people fleeing war in Iraq and in Eritrea and other countries. Thousands of them on the move currently through Greece and Italy. Now, you know, we were told yesterday the EU process and the apparatus is really only cranking up now, very belatedly, to ensure that people currently on the move through Greece and Italy will be assured that if they stay in what are to be known as hotspots there, provision will be made from there to relocate them through cooperation, I understand, with the Italian and Greek authorities. But I think that you know, there is a huge problem for people who are currently facing such an uncertain future. They must be given an assurance that there will be, you know, adequate provision for relocation from those countries. I would agree with, I think, Senator Van Turnhout about the need for sanctions for those EU countries that are not showing the compassion and the humanity that we're seeing in Germany, particularly for Hungary, which has behaved so appallingly towards refugees. And indeed, for my own country, in my father's country of origin, the Czech Republic has not been particularly generous either. So I think, you know, it behoves us in Ireland to be strong on this issue and to seek to see that there is a common humanitarian response from across the EU. Could I just raise perhaps a couple of other points? And again, in your role in the Department of Foreign Affairs, I think it's important to ask what Ireland is doing to ensure that there is a strong EU intervention to seek to resolve the cause of this crisis and the cause of this need for people to flee from Syria. What EU interventions are in hand to seek to resolve the war? We're seeing, as others have said, an escalation in terms of Russia's intervention, Iran also backing the Assad regime, the US refusing to countenance any transitional arrangement with Assad in power, and yet, you know, huge numbers of civilians caught in the middle in cities like Aleppo and Homs and so on. So, you know, what are the measures that are being taken? Have the Gulf states a role to play, and is any pressure being put on them? And indeed, are there any sanctions being imposed on countries which are exporting arms to either the Assad regime or to ISIS? And we know that civilians are being targeted by both. I've also been asked in particular to raise the plight of one group, a group that has been targeted by ISIS, albeit in northern Iraq. This is the Yazidi community, and I know Minister Flanagan has spoken on this and recognised the particular plight. They've been singled out as a community for genocidal treatment by ISIS, and I wonder, can we see this group being provided with targeted aid through Irish Aid's programmes, or indeed can we see members of this community being prioritised for resettlement? Finally, I think, you know, in any contribution on the current crisis, I think we must acknowledge the enormous bravery, resilience and courage of Syrian families and Syrian and individuals who have made such incredible journeys, such epic journeys from Syria to seek safety for their children, and to seek a future for themselves. And I think it's really the positive that's come from this is the immense compassion from ordinary citizens across the EU who have been, you know, showing their support and their compassion in such huge numbers. In Ireland, we've seen it in websites, in you know, pledges of support from uplift.ie, and as you say, Minister, I would echo your words that the Red Cross are to be commended for taking on the coordination of pledges from members of the public, and their website, which was just established on Monday, I know they'll be seeking to make sure there are concrete pledges being given and to follow up on those to ensure that we will make provision. We see it in my own children's school where the children packaged up thousands of toiletries packs, and I'll just finish on this, for refugees on the border in Greece and in Italy. And we're seeing it I think there is a real political will to help in any way we can these people who are caught in such a terrible situation and who are trying to get to refuge in Europe.